The night presses down like a weight. You are standing at the edge of a Roman military camp, where silence is never truly silent. The wind carries the smell of leather, iron, and unwashed bodies. Torches spit and hiss, their flames bending against the darkness, casting long, trembling shadows over rows of tents. You hear laughter somewhere in the distance, but it is not the laughter of men celebrating victory. It is sharp, jagged, mocking. It crawls beneath your skin, telling you that something here is wrong. The Roman legion was the most disciplined force the ancient world had ever seen, steel in formation, iron in will. To the outside world, it was perfection. But discipline was only a mask. Behind the rigid drills and the gleaming armor lay urges that were darker, more dangerous than any blade. What you are about to witness is not the Rome of marble statues and triumphal arches. It is the Rome hidden in whispers, the Rome that lived and died in the shadows of its own soldiers. You see the figures gathered around a single man, their comrade in arms. He has fought beside them, bled beside them, yet now he stands trembling beneath their gaze. Their eyes burn, not with loyalty, but with the hunger of men who confuse power with pleasure. The campfire throws a cruel light across their faces, making them look less like soldiers and more like predators. You feel the air change, the tension so sharp it might cut your skin. This is not camaraderie. This is spectacle. Rome demanded control. But here, control meant domination. Acts that were supposed to bind men together in brotherhood became rituals of humiliation. Sex was no longer intimacy, it was a weapon. A man could be broken without a sword ever touching him, his spirit shattered by shame that lingered longer than scars. You can almost hear the crack in his soul, louder than the clash of any shield. And yet, this was not rare. It was not an accident of drunken men in a camp. It was woven into the very fabric of Rome's military life. Sexual practices among soldiers were not hidden sins, they were tools, of power, of discipline, of cruelty. They could decide who held loyalty and who became an outcast. They could spread sickness faster than a wildfire in dry grass. They could weaken entire legions before a single battle had begun. Rome's greatness was carved by conquest, but beneath that glory ran rivers of darkness. In the brothels that shadowed the empire's edges, in the punishments that turned desire into death, in the rituals that made survival a matter of submission, you will see the truths Rome tried to bury. If you follow further, you will see the camps where disease devoured flesh faster than enemy arrows. You will see how lust was used as a chain to bind soldiers tighter than iron shackles. You will see the punishments that left men begging for death rather than shame. And you will see how the hunger for control and excess would one day hollow Rome from the inside out. If you can stomach learning the hidden side of Rome's soldiers, then subscribing to Tale of History is the least you can do. If you won't, ask yourself, why choose ignorance when the past is begging to be heard? By torchlight the truth grows darker still. Step further into the camp and you will see the shadows lengthen into narrow corridors of tents and rough wooden stalls. At first glance, it looks like any marketplace hastily built at the frontier of empire. But as you listen closer, the sounds that rise from these corners are not the cries of merchants selling goods, nor the clang of armor being mended. They are softer, fractured sounds, stifled sobs, strained laughter, whispers that vanish into silence the moment you draw near. These are not homes of soldiers. These are Rome's makeshift brothels. Wherever the legion marched, brothels followed. Sometimes they were built by opportunistic traders who saw profit in hunger. Other times, they were sanctioned by commanders themselves, who believed that controlling desire was as important as controlling formation on the battlefield. In Rome's eyes, a soldier's body belonged to the state, not to himself. His strength was an asset, his loyalty a currency, and even his lust was subject to regulation. To deny him access to these brothels was to risk rebellion. To allow him unbridled freedom was to risk chaos. And so a balance was struck, discipline by day, indulgence by night. But this indulgence was never innocent. These brothels were filled with women who had no choice. Enslaved captives dragged from conquered lands, young girls stolen from villages, widows who had lost everything but their bodies, all were thrown into service for the legions. They were not companions, they were property, and every visit was an act of brutality dressed as necessity. Soldiers who had just slaughtered fathers and brothers by the thousands would return to claim wives and daughters as spoils of war. In the eyes of Rome, this was not a crime. It was part of conquest. The imbalance of power was absolute. A soldier armed with coin, shield, and law could do what he pleased. And the women? They carried the silence. They bore the pain. They endured the night so the legion could march by day. Yet their suffering left scars that the empire itself could not ignore. For the brothels were not only sites of humiliation, they were breeding grounds of death. Disease stalked these camps like a shadow no sword could cut down. Unnamed plagues spread from one soldier to another, festering in the ranks. Wounds from battle might heal, but infections born in a brothel rotted men from within. Syphilitic sores, fevers, and wasting sickness thinned regiments before the enemy even raised their spears. Some legions were crippled not by ambush, but by their own indulgence. Rome prided itself on strategy, on the strength of its legions, but in truth it was weakened from within, undone by an enemy it invited into its own tent. The commanders knew. They counted the dead, they saw the weakened soldiers, yet they continued the practice. Because to Rome, the brothel was not only about pleasure, it was about control. Soldiers bound by discipline and starved of release might turn their rage against their officers. A satisfied soldier, diseased or not, was easier to command. And so the brothels remained, standing like open wounds at the edge of empire. Imagine walking through those narrow stalls. The torchlight flickers on faces, hollow eyes staring back at you, women who no longer remember their own names, soldiers who pay not for love but for dominance. The smell of sweat and sickness lingers in the air, heavy enough to choke you. You realize that what you are witnessing is not pleasure at all. It is a ritual of power, a system designed to feed Rome's hunger, no matter the cost. Rome forced its victims into silence. Don't repeat that mistake, subscribe so these voices aren't buried twice. If you won't, maybe admit in the comments why you'd rather stay comfortable than face history's truth. Power in Rome was not only measured by who held the sword, but by who could force another to kneel without one. Within the legions, where rank was sacred and obedience was survival, sex became another battlefield, one where dominance was carved not into flesh with steel, but into the spirit with shame. Generals and centurions understood that fear alone could fracture loyalty. A man could defy an order if his courage outweighed his terror. But humiliation, public, intimate, irreversible, could bind him tighter than chains. There are whispers of commanders who singled out their soldiers, not for valor, but for breaking. A man stripped of his dignity before his comrades would never again look his commander in the eye without remembering what had been taken from him. That memory ensured obedience more effectively than the lash. Imagine the camp after battle, the soldiers gathered in tense silence as their leader exerts his authority in ways unspeakable, forcing submission not with orders but with degradation. Every man watching understands the unspoken lesson: disobedience will not only cost blood, it will cost manhood. The victim is left hollowed, marked by something that wounds deeper than enemy steel. For in Rome, masculinity was everything, and to have it stripped from you was to be rendered less than a soldier, less than a man. The psychological toll was immense. Soldiers hardened by years of war could face death with stoicism, yet many broke under the weight of shame. They carried it in silence, unable to speak, unable to reclaim what had been lost. Battle could end a life, but humiliation stretched endlessly, haunting every glance, every word, every night alone in the dark. For some, it was worse than death itself. This weaponization of sex was not unique to Rome. History tells of Spartan warriors who bound young men through enforced intimacy, transforming loyalty into submission. Among certain tribes of the steppe, conquerors wielded sexual violence to erase the pride of their defeated enemies. In every empire that thrived on war, sex was twisted into a tool not of pleasure, but of control. Yet Rome perfected it, folding humiliation into the discipline of its legions, ensuring obedience not just with orders, but with the threat of disgrace. And so, as the eagle standards glimmered above their formations, and the world saw only steel, order, and glory, the soldiers beneath those banners bore invisible scars. They marched as conquerors, but inside many carried the memory of nights when they were not men of Rome, but objects of its cruelty. If this makes you uncomfortable, good. History should disturb us. Subscribe to Tale of History if you have the courage to face it. If not, comment and explain why you'd rather shut your eyes. Excess was Rome's slowest poison, and it flowed first through the veins of its soldiers. The men who were expected to stand as the wall of empire, unbreakable and unyielding, often spent their nights drowning in indulgence. Pleasure was not a respite from war, it became a ritual of its own, a hunger that devoured discipline. There are stories of legions preparing for battle only to find themselves weakened by the night before. Soldiers stumbling from tents at dawn, bodies still trembling from wine and flesh, their strength spent long before they raised their shields. What should have been a day of victory began with exhaustion, their discipline fractured by their own appetites. In the silence before the enemy's charge, some already carried the fatigue of excess in their bones. The dangers ran deeper than weakness. Ritualized gatherings, meant to bind soldiers in pleasure as they did in war, sometimes turned into death sentences. The same torchlit camps where men sought escape became breeding grounds of infection. Diseases spread like whispers, slow, invisible, inescapable. Fever would strike suddenly, rashes erupted, bodies rotted while still breathing. Commanders counted more dead from indulgence than from steel. Yet the practices endured, for in Rome indulgence was not shameful. It was proof of power. The soldiers learned this excess from the throne itself. Emperors like Tiberius and Caligula turned desire into theater, their lives into grotesque parables of indulgence. Tales spread of Tiberius retreating to his island villa, surrounding himself with youths forced into unholy service, drowning in pleasures that left scars deeper than chains. Caligula, mad with his own divinity, transformed intimacy into spectacle, making degradation a form of entertainment for the court. The soldiers who witnessed this absorbed the lesson: excess was not weakness, it was Rome's right. If emperors could gorge themselves on pleasure until their sanity snapped, why should a soldier deny himself the same? But indulgence always demanded a price. The legions carried diseases across borders, infecting not only their own ranks but also the lands they conquered. Armies once feared for their invincibility became weakened from within. When enemies looked upon Roman soldiers, they sometimes saw not gods of war but men hollowed by their own appetites. The empire that demanded order above all else allowed its foundations to crack under the weight of excess. This hunger was not confined to the body, it corroded the mind. A man who could not control himself off the battlefield could not remain whole upon it. Desire blurred discipline. Lust drained courage. And slowly, silently, indulgence did what no enemy could: it eroded Rome's strength from the inside. Rome collapsed in part because people ignored warning signs like this. If you ignore Tale of History by not subscribing, you're repeating that mistake. Or go ahead, write in the comments why you'd rather watch in silence than support the truth. Excess and indulgence were tolerated only so long as they served Rome's machine. But when desire crossed into realms deemed dangerous, when it threatened discipline, offended superstition, or challenged the fragile order of the camp, the punishment was merciless. Rome knew how to indulge, but it also knew how to destroy. The legions were bound by law as much as by sword, and sexual misconduct could transform a soldier's life into a spectacle of ruin. Punishments were not designed simply to correct, they were crafted to shame, to strip the man of every ounce of dignity before his brothers in arms. Some were beaten until their flesh tore open, each strike a public lesson carved into skin. Others were branded, the mark burned into their bodies to outlive them, a scar that turned their shame into a permanent reminder. And there were those for whom the sentence was death, execution not on the battlefield, but in the camp, surrounded by the very men who once called him comrade. It was not just about the act, but about the fear that act carried with it. Certain practices were believed to offend the gods themselves. In a world where every omen carried weight, where every sign could decide victory or doom, forbidden intimacies were thought to curse entire legions. One man's indulgence could condemn thousands. Superstition made the punishments harsher, the rituals of humiliation more elaborate, because Rome believed the anger of the gods could only be appeased with sacrifice. The body of the guilty became the offering. Imagine the terror of watching a fellow soldier dragged into the center of the camp. The silence of the ranks, the torches casting his shadow larger than life, the officer's voice announcing his crime. Then the spectacle begins, not swift execution, but slow degradation. His armor stripped, his body exposed, his humanity torn away piece by piece. Every man watching knows the lesson: the gods see all, Rome tolerates nothing, and shame is deadlier than any spear. These punishments spread fear more effectively than the lash of an enemy whip. A soldier could march into battle with courage, knowing he might die with honor. But to die in disgrace, to be reduced before his comrades to nothing but a warning, was a fate worse than death. The battlefield demanded bravery, but Rome's punishments demanded submission. And so, obedience was maintained not just by the promise of glory, but by the terror of shame. You've seen how Rome silenced those who broke its rules. Don't silence this channel. Subscribe to Tale of History. And if you won't, tell us why in the comments. Is history not worth remembering? The echoes of Rome's camps have not faded. They linger like a shadow over history, a reminder that conquest was not only forged in steel but in flesh. The stories of brothels, punishments, excess, and humiliation reveal a truth that Rome itself tried to bury, that its greatest military machine was built not only on discipline and strategy but also on the exploitation of bodies and the corrosion of souls. What was praised as strength was often maintained by terror. What was seen as glory was often drenched in silence and shame. The darker side of Rome's legions forces us to confront a reality often hidden in the triumphal arches and marble statues. Soldiers were not only conquerors, they were pawns in a system that fed on their desires, their vulnerabilities, and their submission. Rome weaponized intimacy, turned humiliation into a lesson, and allowed excess to rot the very men it depended on for survival. Behind the banners and standards, the empire consumed its own protectors from within. But history is not a relic. The same shadows creep across modern armies. Reports of sexual violence within the ranks, of power twisted into exploitation, of silence enforced by shame, show us that the story did not end with Rome. Even now, institutions that claim honor and discipline wrestle with the same darkness, the struggle to control desire, the silence of victims, the scars carried long after the battlefield. Rome teaches us that when these truths are ignored, the cost is not only personal but civilizational. For Rome's might did not collapse because the barbarians stormed its gates in a single night. It withered long before, weakened by excess, hollowed by corruption, undone by wounds inflicted from within. The legions that once stood invincible began to falter, not because their enemies grew stronger, but because their discipline rotted under the weight of indulgence and shame. Empires rarely fall with a sword, they crumble slowly, quietly, eaten alive by what they refuse to face. And as you stand in the ruins of their legacy, one truth becomes clear: Rome's soldiers were not only instruments of conquest. They were also victims of their commanders, their emperors, their own empire's hunger. They carried its glory on their shields, but its cruelty was etched into their bodies and their silence. In the end, they were as broken as those they conquered. Every empire falls when it buries its darkest truths. Don't let these stories die again. Subscribe to Tale of History now. Or comment below and confess why you're turning away from the past.